Well, hello, COS supporters. Welcome back to a special edition of COS Live. My name is Andrew Lusch, and I'm joined by Rita Peters, who's our Senior Vice President for Legislative Affairs. Rita, it feels like it's been a lifetime since I saw you last. How you doing?
Hardly, Andrew. We did a marathon COS Live just a couple of hours ago?
Right. Yep, we were in Iowa covering a committee hearing there where we got a victory. We didn't get to see it, unfortunately, because there were some technical issues in the legislature, but we still got a victory nonetheless. And now we're jumping over to Nebraska. We're going to the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee, where they are going to be considering LR 14. And this is a resolution that would remove an expiration date with the Convention of States resolution that was passed in Nebraska a couple of years ago. So Mark Meckler is expected to be there and to give some testimony, so that's real exciting. Rita, can we get our viewers caught up with why we're covering the sunset clause and how it's really important to our movement?
Absolutely. Well, Nebraska was the 17th state to pass the COS action resolution. That was back in 2022, but it was done with an expiration date. This has happened in a few states. Oklahoma and Missouri have already removed their expiration dates, and Texas this year is in the process of removing theirs. That would leave Nebraska as the only other state with a sunset clause on the COS resolution, causing it to expire. Now, it doesn't expire this year, but we still want to go ahead and get it taken off. In the 3 years since the resolution was passed, the COS Nebraska volunteer team has not gone away. They've been busy building support across the state and in the legislature. Over 22,000 Nebraskans have now signed the Convention of States petition asking their state legislators to vote yes on COS. A scientific survey shows that over 2/3 of Nebraskans, 66%, favor the state calling for an Article 5 convention to propose constitutional amendments that limit federal spending, limit federal power, and establish term limits for members of Congress and other federal officials potentially. That is exactly what this Nebraska Unicameral Committee is about to consider in just a few moments. Republicans widely favor Nebraska calling for a convention of states. 79% of Republicans in Nebraska favor it, as does a majority of Democrats in the state at 53%. So those legislators who may filibuster today would be doing so in opposition not only to their constitutional duty, but also to the will of the people. Now, we're not expecting the committee to vote today. If we have a successful vote in executive session, which will happen sometime after the hearing today, that would clear the way for the Nebraska Unicameral to schedule debate on the floor for a resolution. And again, Nebraska is the only unicameral legislature in the country. That means it's the only one that just has one chamber. So we just have one chamber to get through there. Our resolution number in Nebraska is LR 14. And this isn't the only resolution we're going to show you today in this committee hearing, because our 34 Ready bill is also expected to be heard. And in Nebraska, that will be called LB 259. Now, sandwiched right in between of our COS application and our 34 Ready bill, they've scheduled another Article 5 application hearing, and that is the one that's for just term limits alone. So our plan, assuming they go according to schedule, according to their agenda this morning, they don't always, as we learned in Iowa, but if they do, our plan is to go ahead and let you hear the discussion and public testimony for all three of those measures. First, our COS application, LR 14. Second, the Article 5 application for a term limits only convention. And then third, LB 259, which is our 34 Ready legislation in Nebraska. So the committee is starting out with one bill. I think that's what they're doing right now. You can see them there. And Producer G is keeping an eye on that hearing for us. Once they move into discussion of our application, then we'll go live and bring you coverage of that committee hearing as it unfolds. That was a lot.
Rita, and we're coming off of live coverage in Iowa. We were there for almost 2 hours, I think. At least that's what I remember.
Yeah.
Something that stuck out to me as you were talking is back in 2022 when we passed in Nebraska. That was actually my first the first victory that I saw for Convention of States, because I came on in 2019, so didn't see anything in 2019, 2020, and 2021. But in 2022, it was the first time I ever saw a victory for our COS resolution. So it's a pretty special moment for me. But something that I recall is just our amazing champion, Senator Halloran, who was really instrumental in getting us past there. And I'm just really excited to come back and get the sunset provision removed. And I'm just really excited to see this hearing come up.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to it too. And our sponsor this year is Senator Lippincott. So that's who we'll see. I haven't heard from him anymore yet this year, but I can tell you that, as we mentioned, Mark Meckler is on the ground there in Nebraska, and he has been working with Senator Lippincott, meeting with some of the committee members and other legislators just to firm up support for what we're trying to do there in Nebraska. And Andrew, just in case anyone here wasn't listening this morning and didn't already hear all of my extensive recap of our national situation, we have had 2 chamber victories already this year. Both the South Dakota Senate and the Wyoming Senate have already passed our resolution. Of course, we did go on to a defeat in the South Dakota House, but before that, we passed the South Dakota Senate by a vote of 23-9. And that represented a huge step for us in South Dakota, because up until this year, we had been stalled out for years. We had seen virtually no progress there because leadership that was in place before this year was opposed and just set up kind of a permanent roadblock to us. But the roadblocks are now gone. And again, we secured a major victory, 23-9 in the South Dakota Senate earlier this year. And we're coming back in 2026 for the House. And we expect to add South Dakota to our growing list of states that have already passed the Convention of States application. We also were victorious in the Wyoming Senate last month. I think it was last month. We passed there by a vote of 22-7. Again, a huge margin. And I can tell you today, I've been working with our Wyoming State Director, Julie Baker, who is just doing an amazing job there. She's actually texting me right now. She is in the legislature there in Cheyenne today, meeting with representatives and trying to secure the support we need in order to get our floor vote and win our floor vote in Wyoming. At the committee level, we scored a preliminary victory in an Iowa Senate subcommittee and an Iowa House subcommittee, and then just today went on to pass the Iowa House full state government committee, which means that the next stop for us in Iowa is a full debate and floor vote in the Iowa House. But again, our grassroots teams are working hard to make sure that when we do go to the floor debate and vote, we have the votes we need to pass. In New Hampshire, our House committee voted 10-7 to advance our resolution to the House floor. We're still waiting for that House floor debate to be scheduled. A committee in the Kansas Senate voted on a voice vote to advance our resolution to the floor for debate. And folks, we expect that debate in the Kansas Senate to happen yet this afternoon. We're not exactly sure about timing. In fact, this committee hearing could run up against that Kansas Senate floor vote. And I want y'all to know that whenever we're doing these multiple hearings and floor debates in the same day, producer G's somehow got his eyes on all of it. I don't know how many screens he has, but I picture him in like, the White House control room with all these screens all over where he's keeping an eye on everything. And then last little bit of update I'll give you on the national situation is about Idaho. The Idaho House Committee on Judiciary and Rules voted in a real nail biter to recommend passage of our application. So that is pending in Idaho for a full House floor vote. And now I will pause for breath, Andrew.
I don't know how you got all of that in, Rita. That's impressive. And how you keep it all straight, even with Garrett's cheat sheet, how you keep it all straight. It's just really amazing. What I notice is that we just have seen so many victories this past 2 months. And it's crazy to me to say that it's only been 2 months. It feels like it's been 6 months at the speed we've been going. But it's just every day there's new victories coming in, new hearings that we have to cover. And it's just incredible to see all of the victories that that are happening in the states right now. So we got to keep the pressure on, Rita. We got to keep the pressure on and get state number 20, 21, 22, 23, and just keep going all the way to 34, because that's that magic number we need. We need 34 states to get this thing going, to get a point where we can start discussing amendments to the U.S. Constitution, and then get those amendments passed, and then start ratifying amendments and start making real change, Rita, because we got a lot of issues and a lot of problems that need solving, and Congress ain't going to solve them.
Absolutely. That's for sure. And, I bet some folks out there might be interested to see, we keep saying we've passed in 19 states already. I know producer G somewhere has a beautiful graphic that shows, there it is. So in green, you'll see the list of states that have passed our Article 5 application, and it is currently pending in all of those states that you see in green, just waiting for their sister states to follow suit and to step up with courage and say, yes, we want to meet in convention to talk about amendments on these 3 topics. The states in blue are where we have active applications pending this year. And the states in yellow are, Wyoming and South Dakota, we mentioned a few minutes ago as having passed in one chamber this year. So that gives you a little bit of a picture of where we are. You'll see the Northeast is a little tough, and the West is a little tough. We've pretty much got the South and got a lot of the heartland, but we're working all the areas. And Andrew, some of our viewers may not realize we have active, organized, engaged state teams in all 50 states. There is no state that's not working on this. There's no state where the legislators are not being educated about Article 5 and encouraged to use the power that the founders bequeathed to the state legislatures for such a time as this. And, just to remind everyone, the whole reason the founders put the convention method for proposing amendments into Article 5 was because near the very end of the convention, Colonel George Mason from my home state, Virginia, stood up and said, oh no, we can't do it this way. We can't leave the only power to propose amendments with Congress, because then we'll never get the amendments we need if Congress should become abusive. And at that point, the delegates at the convention realized their mistake, and they unanimously and without even debate added the convention mechanism, giving the states a way to bypass Congress and propose needed amendments. So I'm proud of our teams and what they're doing all over the country. Andrew, I know you are too.
Oh yeah, Rita, of course, I'm very proud of all of our teams. And more than just having active teams in every state, we also have petitions in every single legislative district in the country. That is a huge milestone that we hit at Convention of States. So every single legislative district has petitions calling for a convention from constituents, which is incredible. And our petition is not like any other petition out there. We're not just creating an email list and collecting people's email information so that we can send them information about donations and stuff like that. We're actually sending emails directly to legislators when people sign the petition. So if you sign the petition, your petition goes directly to your state representative. That is huge. It's an amazing thing that we do at Convention of States, and unlike many other organizations out there. And, we have, like you said, active teams in every single state, and we have them in states where it's difficult. Like in my region, Nevada, California, Hawaii, New Mexico, Oregon, and Washington. Those are some tough states. But if you look on that map, there's 3 states in my region. Half my region has active legislation. So our teams, they see the issues in the federal government, and they see the hurdles in their own state legislature, but they go there with courage anyway, and they make their best attempt to get the resolution passed, because our resolution is nonpartisan. We're not just fighting in red states. We're fighting in red states, blue states, purple states. We're fighting all over the United States, Rita.
Yep.
So,
and we do struggle a little bit more. Okay, we struggle a lot more to get support from Democrat legislators, which it's a little bit surprising, just because it is clear from the polling. Every poll we've ever done shows that a majority of Democrat voters do support what we're trying to do. It is a little bit harder to get Democrat support, or a lot harder to get Democrat support in the legislatures, but it's not impossible. We had, just last year, we had our primary sponsor of our application in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives was a Democrat. Hawaii, which is one of your states, Andrew, they have a lot of Democrat supporters. They get a lot of Democrat votes. They passed a supermajority Democrat committee last year, as they did in Massachusetts as well. So we do sometimes succeed in getting support from, the reasonable, logic-minded Democrat legislators who understand that Convention of States is not about trying to put one brand of public policy in place. Rather, it's about who decides. It's about where those public policy decisions get made. Do they all get made in Washington, D.C.? Or do they get made at the state level, closer to home, closer to the people, where the elected officials do rub shoulders with the people they're representing and understand the problems that they're facing and what the best solutions are for their state? That's what it's about, right?
Right. I couldn't agree more with you, Rita. Yeah, and I want to go back to what you're saying about Colonel George Mason, because while we're out there and we're doing all of the work to build relationships with legislators, but we keep coming up against opposition, and it's so unfortunate that people have been led astray by our opponents' talking points, because they will often say that Congress would control a convention. And it was just as you were talking about, as you were outlining the history of Article 5 and how it got inserted into the Constitution, I couldn't help but think about how our detractors will say, well, Congress is going to control this thing. Congress is going to take over. It says right there in Article 5 that they get to call or name the time and place. So that means Congress controls this. And I always go back to what you had said on a previous COS Live about how that is just a ministerial task, and that's a complete misunderstanding of what the text of Article 5 says. But our opponents, they don't care. They hang their hat on this hook, and unfortunately, it drives some people, through fear, it drives them away from us. But I guess my point is that that's not the truth. And in the last broadcast, we were talking about how Convention of States and our grassroots are out there shining a light on the truth of Article 5. And we're shining a light on this solution that we have that we can use to bring sensible reform to Washington, D.C., because it used to be not long ago that more power was centered in the states than in Washington, D.C. The powers of the federal government, they were few and defined, and the states were broad and unlimited. And now it's the other way around. It's the paradigm has shifted, and now it's the states they have less power than they did, and the federal government controls everything. It centralizes everything, and then it attaches strings to things so that they can wield power over the states, right? With taxation and stuff like that. Anyway, this is an opportunity that we have to reverse that, to shift the paradigm back to what the founders envisioned, where the states had more control and they had more power in their state because they had some level of state sovereignty. So this is hopefully, as we continue to go to legislatures and bring our message and just continue to shine that light on Article 5, that more people will come around and they will see that our opponents out there, they don't know what they're talking about, and that they're just using it as those fear tactics to persuade people to not use this great solution that our founding fathers gave to us.
Andrew, yeah, absolutely. Amen to all of that. And I want to come back just for a minute to what you were saying about this whole argument that Congress would control the whole convention. And I just want to point out that if you know the history, if you either, believe us about what we just said about the purpose of the convention mechanism, or if you've read for yourself James Madison's notes on the convention, which is where we find out that the reason they put the convention mechanism into Article 5 was to let the states have the power to bypass Congress to propose needed amendments. So if you know that, and you're still saying that no, under Article 5, Congress controls the convention, then you are saying that you believe that the founding fathers were blundering idiots who set out to do one thing and totally failed. And instead, just in Article 5, just for some reason, gave Congress two different ways to accomplish the same thing. It doesn't make any logical sense. And secondly, in addition to that, why would Congress bother to, try to get the amendments that it wants to make through using the Article 5 process when it has its own process? It doesn't need to use the convention process. It has its own Article 5 process. It can propose amendments any day that it wants. It doesn't need an Article 5 convention. So, it's arguments like that when you break them down, the opponent's arguments just don't make sense. They don't hold water. And that's one thing that can be frustrating to the folks in our movement, like particularly Senator Rick Santorum, Michael Farris, Mark Meckler, because they're going out there in all these different legislatures week after week, and they're hearing these same arguments that don't make sense, aren't logical, defy history and precedent, and in some cases, case law. And, yet they get just a few minutes to testify and make the case for convention of states. So it can be frustrating, but it is what we are called to do, is, like you said, to shine the light, to speak truth, to overcome fear with actual good information. So that's what we have to keep doing over and over again.
Yep, and we keep coming back, and we're not going anywhere. We talked about how our grassroots, they persevere, and our grassroots, they get the job done. It's funny because there's so many states, like take West Virginia, for example. I remember we saw that state year after year. We just couldn't get the job done in West Virginia. And then all of a sudden it clicked and we got it through. And it wasn't some magic potion or some wave of a wand. It was continuously coming back and being relentless, making sure that we continued to build relationships with the leadership and with all of the legislators there, and making sure that we continue to build the grassroots. I mean, and that's so much of our secret sauce is our grassroots. They do all of the hard, heavy lifting and all of the yeoman's work. Of course, we got our senior advisors like Mark and Rick and Mike, and we have Mark out there. and they're doing so much work too. But it's those grassroots that are really, really they're just continuing to push the movement by getting new petitions, building relationships with legislators, and doing all of that they need to do to make sure that they can be successful in the legislature. And it's really just an inspiration to see our grassroots do that every single day, because we've been at this, Rita, for 10 years now, and it's been a long haul for our grassroots, and they're gonna get the job done. I know they are.
That's right. Well, Andrew, I want to mention, because we've talked a little bit about some of the arguments that our opponents make and the frustration that we sometimes experience witnessing the same bad arguments made in state after state after state. And then we have our amazing headliners who are actually credentialed experts on the topic. And I want to say it's important for people who don't have time to do all of the in-depth research. They don't have time to read, Rob Nadelson's very scholarly treatise on the law of Article 5. If you can't do all of the research yourself, it's important to figure out who the real experts are that you can trust. And on that topic, I understand Producer G has a little video for us that sort of outlines the credentials and expertise of our headliners. I'd love to show that to our viewers if we have that ready, Producer G.
Ferris, Rick Santorum, Mark Meckler, and Robert Nadelson are the proven trusted leaders spearheading the Convention of States movement. Constitutional attorney Michael Ferris has argued before the appellate courts of 13 states, 8 federal circuit courts of appeals, and twice before the Supreme Court of the United States. He's one of the few living attorneys who has successfully litigated an Article 5 case. As the founder of the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, Ferris spearheaded the effort to legalize homeschooling in all 50 states. He also founded Patrick Henry College, the preeminent pre-law college in America, where he taught law for 18 years. He served as president of Alliance for Defending Freedom, the preeminent religious liberty organization in America. ADF won 11 of 12 Supreme Court cases on his watch. ADF was also co-counsel for winning the Dobbs case, overturning Roe v. Wade. Ferris was co-chairman of the drafting committee for the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. He's also written a peer-reviewed law article proving the 1787 convention acted appropriately and lawfully. The Honorable Rick Santorum is senior advisor for Convention of States. Senator Santorum was a candidate for the Republican nomination for president in 2012 and 2016, winning the 2012 Iowa caucuses, 10 additional states, and nearly 4 million votes. Prior to his campaigns for president, Rick served 2 terms in both the House of Representatives and Senate, where he gained a reputation as one of the nation's leading fighters for fiscal responsibility and the right to life. Robert G. Nadelson, a law professor of 25 years, Nadelson's research has been cited repeatedly at the U.S. Supreme Court, federal appeals courts, and state Supreme Courts, both by parties and by state and federal judges and justices. He is widely acknowledged to be the nation's preeminent scholar on the Article 5 convention process, having written the only legal treatise on the subject. Nadelson heads the Independence Institute's Constitutional Studies Center and its Article 5 Information Center. Attorney Mark Meckler co-founded the largest Tea Party group in America before co-founding Convention of States Action. As president, Mark has led the organization to have a grassroots presence in all 7,000 plus state legislative districts in the nation. He frequently appears in the media as a voice for everyday Americans. He also stood up to the IRS when it targeted Tea Party groups and led a successful lawsuit against the IRS, winning a substantial settlement benefiting local Tea Party groups. The leaders opposing Convention of States Action?
It provides for, among other horrors, setting up a parliament over the United States, Canada, and Mexico.
Joanna Martin, aka Joanna Scutari, who also blogs and speaks under the pseudonym Publius Hulda. A former attorney, she married a white supremacist Frank Scutari after he was convicted of aiding and abetting Richard Scutari with crimes related to armed robbery, the Allenberg murder, the Aryan Nations, and other anti-government groups. Robert Owens is program director for the John Birch Society. As an attorney, he made news in 2022 when the Ohio Supreme Court suspended him and a Delaware County grand jury indicted him on 6 counts of felony theft. Owens is facing criminal investigations due to deceitful and dishonest conduct, failing to communicate, and failing to provide a timely refund to 4 separate clients. Robert Brown, another program director for the John Birch Society. Unlike Owens or Scutari, Brown has never been an attorney, although he does talk out of both sides of his mouth. After claiming to be a nationally known expert and scholar before multiple state legislatures.
I am a nationally known constitutional scholar. As a constitutional scholar with a particular interest in the Article 5 Convention.
He later admitted that he has no credentials.
I don't pretend to have any particular credentials other than the fact that I have a very rare quality that I have the ability to read.
None of these opponents have written anything scholarly on the subject of the Article 5 Convention, but they parade around different state legislatures as if they have special knowledge or expertise. Convention of States leaders are proven, lifelong, principled fighters for liberty, battle-tested and refined by the fire. They have accomplished big things in the battle for freedom, proving their credibility. Who do you trust?
Well, Rita, the difference between our senior advisors and our headliners and the opposition is pretty stark.
Andrew, I'm actually feeling giddy over here. I somehow have never seen that video before. And while it was playing, I was sending it to some of our grassroots who are in legislatures today so that they can share this. I mean, that is dynamite. Like, how do you respond to that if you're the opponents? It just seems like such an open and shut case as far as where the real expertise and credentials lie. Right.
Right. I love the rare quality of knowing how to read.
Yes.
I didn't realize that was a rare quality. I would say constitutional scholar would be a rare quality, though.
That was, that Robert Brown. I remember when he said that. I was watching that committee hearing. It has to be my favorite moment in a committee hearing ever. It was just such a ridiculous thing to say. And then, Publius Hulda, we haven't seen her testify here anywhere. So I'm not sure what's up with her, but when she does testify, she always likes to bring out all these papers about a new world order. And, I'm always thinking, okay, yes, we're aware there are some crazy people in the world, but what does that have to do with us and why we're here today? So it's really interesting. And, who knows who we'll see testify in opposition to Convention of States today. If you're just joining us, we are waiting for the Nebraska Committee on Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs to start the hearing on our Convention of States application, LR 14. We're trying to pass it again this year because the original application carried a sunset clause. So that's what we're doing here today. We expect the committee to hear 3 measures that we're going to watch: our application, which again is LR 14, an application for a convention to impose term limits only, and then finally LB 259, which is our 34 ready legislation in Nebraska. So they only had one bill on the agenda before us, LB 662, and looks like the hearing and testimony for that bill is still going on. But hopefully they'll be switching over to LR 14 soon.
Yes, and Rita, we do have a few more videos that we can play and comment on while we wait for the committee to move to our resolution. I want to go back, though, for just a moment before we go to the next video that Producer G has lined up for us. And, one of the things that really boggles my mind is our opposition always says things like Mark Meckler lies and Rick Santorum is a lie. They always try and label us as deceivers or liars. And, that really sticks in my craw because that one of those JBS leaders was under investigation for saying misleading statements and for lying. And that really bothers me because it's always the one who's finger pointing who tends to do what they are accusing others of doing. And so it's a real shame that our opponents have so much influence with people, because we have this great idea, this great solution that we can use, and we could have gotten there a lot faster if they'd have been on our side instead of bringing in fellows like that guy into their leadership. So it's real unfortunate.
Yeah, it's interesting to note too. I wonder how many people could name something positive and constructive for the country that Publius Hulda or Robert Brown or any of the JBS folks have done. What's their idea? And usually when you ask them, they say, well, we have to educate the American people. Well, guess who's doing that? It's Convention of States. We're educating the American people about the Constitution. Or they say, we need to elect good people. We need to win elections. Well, we've all been trying to do that and oftentimes doing that for many years. But electing good people and sending them to Washington can't result in the kind of permanent structural reforms that we need in this country to place additional limitations on the federal government.
Yep. Speaking of education, Justice Scalia, he was a strong supporter of Article 5, and he talked about that in videos that we have, where he is a proponent of using Article 5 for amendments that would curtail some of federal power. Unfortunately, our opponents have twisted some of his words, and so I think this is a good moment where we can look at what Scalia had said and set the record straight and do some educating on what Scalia actually said. Producer G, do you have that video?
That the Congress is simply unwilling to give attention to many issues which it knows the people are concerned with, and which issues involve restrictions upon the federal government's own power. I think the founders foresaw that, and they provided this method in order to enable a convention to remedy that. If the only way to get that convention is to take this minimal risk, then I think it is a reasonable risk to be undergone. The alternative is continuing with a system that provides no means of obtaining a constitutional amendment except through the kindness of the Congress, which has demonstrated that it does not want to have any other way to get a constitutional amendment. The Congress knows that the people want more fiscal responsibility, but it is unable to provide it. Now, what we need is some means at the federal level, like Proposition 13. The Constitution has provided it. I suggest that if the only way to clarify the law, if the only way to remove us from utter bondage to the Congress is to take what I think to be a minimal risk on this limited convention, then let's take it. I listed first among my the things I would like to have considered structural issues at the federal level. I don't have a lack of trust in the American people. I mean, I'm the one up here who's least terrified of a convention. Yeah, we've come a long way. We've gotten over a lot of problems, but the fact remains that there is a widespread, deep feeling of powerlessness in the country. One sees it on every side with respect to many issues, not just the budget issues. The people do not feel that their wishes are observed. They're heard, but they're not observed, particularly at the federal level. Now, the Congress has come up with a lot of palliatives for this problem, among which I was on a panel a few days ago discussing the legislative veto, for example, which to my mind doesn't solve the problem at all. The basic problem...
Well, Rita, it looks like we're going to cut that video short because our bill appears to be coming up right now in the Nebraska Committee.
All right, let's go there.
Good afternoon and welcome, Senator Lippincott.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Sanders and the Government and Military Affairs Committee. My name is Loren Lippincott. That's Loren Lippincott, and I do represent the District 34 here in Nebraska. In 2022, the Nebraska legislature passed legislative resolution number 1414, which was an application to Congress for a convention of states. This year, my legislative resolution was bestowed the same number, LR 14. LR 14 would rescind our current application, which does have a sunset clause, which is the 1st of February, 2027, and replace it with the same application simply without the sunset. This legislative resolution calls for the state of Nebraska to call for a limited Article 5 conventions of states, which would discuss and potentially propose amendments to the U.S. Constitution. A convention of states cannot be called without 33 states, that's 2/3, 34 states passing matching resolutions to call for one. Currently, there are 19 states which have the same language as ours on the books. And of course, Nebraska is one of those 19. There is legislation in all 31 of the other states introduced and up for discussion. Now, once 34 states, that is 2/3 of the states, have passed the same language, an Article 5 Convention of States is called. Every state would be represented, and through a convention process, amendments are proposed. The proposed amendments can be ratified if 38 states, that is 3/4 of the 50 states, vote favorably. Legislative resolution number 14 calls for a convention to propose 3 specific topics for amendments. Number 1, they would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. Of course, as we all know, the national debt right now is at $36 trillion, and the clock just continues to tick. And it's very interesting to note that not only do we have a $36 trillion debt, but it's well over $100 trillion invested spending for entitlement programs like Social Security. Interest on the debt just this past year has now exceeded our defense spending. Number 2, limit the power and jurisdiction of federal government. It's interesting to note that regulation compliance cost $3 trillion a year. That was in 2022, which was 12% of our GDP. That's more than all personal income tax and corporate tax combined. This causes an economic loss of 25% or $4 trillion a year. That's considerable. Point number 3, limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. It's interesting to note that over 90% of incumbents in the U.S. House and Senate are reelected each election cycle. The status quo is not working. By requiring matching resolutions by 34 states, that is 2/3 of the states, it naturally creates a structured framework for the subjects discussed during the convention. This is so important because this is the limiting factor and why the runaway convention argument does not work. These 3 topics are what they are gathered to talk about and to create amendments for. This process is laid out in Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution as a method to propose amendments to the Constitution. This is not an instrument to rewrite the Constitution or create some kind of new government. Article 5 even explicitly states that a convention can only meet for the purpose of proposing amendments. Article 5 provides equality between Congress and states when it comes to proposing amendments to the Constitution. The opposing side will argue that we're not in control and that the convention can run away. They will argue that there is no control in the process and that once a convention convenes, the delegates will become, quote, drunk with power, that they have been given and to go off track and outside the subject matter within the resolution that it called. But if 34 states must have identical language in the resolutions that they pass in each state, then those states, which will be the majority at the convention, will know the lines within they need to color. They are bound to the scope that is in the resolution. However, if that is the only reason or concern, that is why I've introduced LB 259. We'll be discussing that in a bit. That outlines and ensures that Nebraska delegates to such a convention would be bound to the scope and subject matter in the state's application. Even if the convention were to, quote, run away, and they were to bring amendments to vote for the Easter Bunny as president, any proposed amendment that would be agreed upon would go back to the states for ratification. That's important. And it would take 3/4 of the states, that is 38 states, voting in favor of the amendment to make that happen. And of course, 3/4 is the same as Congress when they propose amendments to the Constitution. Same for them, same for us. So let's pretend now that 34 states have passed the same resolution. Now, again, just as a review, 19 presently have passed it. We need 15 more. That would equal 34. So let's just go forward in time and talk through this. We would all then send delegates, and they would agree on amendments. Now, the only thing that Congress has to do in this is they have to determine where and when that meeting would take place. So let's just say, for instance, they said, Omaha is right in the middle of the United States. We'll have it in Omaha on such and such date. So everybody meets right there, and then 38 out of the 50 states would have to agree upon it. So that would be 3/4. Those amendments come back to Nebraska for ratification. The same process for adopting an amendment made by Congress would then revert to our rules. Then it would be our legislature that would have to work on this. Our rules say that under Rule 4, Section 2 of the Rules of the Nebraska Unicameral Legislature, quote, states, and I quote, when considered as a bill, resolutions which propose amendments to the state constitution propose the ratification or rejection of amendments to the federal constitution or memorialize the Congress with regard to amendments to the U.S. Constitution shall be considered and adopted in the same manner as bills. So it'd be much like how we do things here today with our normal legislative bills. The Government and Military Affairs Committee would then be referenced or would refer and reference any such amendment. So the same process of public notice, testimony, committee member questions would happen as we have here today. Then it would have to go through the executive committee. They would have to exec on it. And that process would then vote the bill out of committee. If passed, it would go to the floor for debate. If fully debated and passed by the legislature, then the state of Nebraska would have ratified it, and 49 other states would process any amendment in their own manner. Then if, and only if, 38 of the 50 states ratify the proposed amendment, does it get added to the Constitution? This is not something that will be done easily. In fact, only 27 amendments have been ratified by the requisite number of states. And 10 of those, of course, as we know, is the Bill of Rights, making it only 17. There are 6 proposed amendments now that have yet to be ratified by 38 states. That's a high bar with guardrails in place so that there's no fear of runaway convention. As a matter of fact, it's interesting to note that from 1789 to current day, there's been 11,848 proposed amendments to the Constitution. And of course, we only have 27. So there's a lot of filters. With that, I'll take questions. And if I cannot answer your questions, there's a couple of people behind me who may be able to. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lippincott. Check to see if there are any questions from the committee. Senator Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for being here, Senator Lippincott. It's an interesting topic. And I talked to the gentleman who I assume is going to testify, and he brought this up to me that the term limits part is not just for members of Congress, but officials. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, again, they'll get down into the specifics once they meet. I use the example of meeting in Omaha. So they would have to make that determination. Right now, it goes from a broad topic to a specific topic. So the broad topic are the three items that we talked about: limiting power, limiting spending, limiting term limits. So those are the three broad areas, and all 34 states would have to agree to that. And then once they meet together, as I use the example of Omaha, then they meet together and say, well, just exactly how specific do we want to get with limiting the terms? So the specifics would come down the road some.
So by what, I guess my question is, what do we mean by officials as distinct from members of Congress?
I've heard all kinds of different things that have been proposed. So again, this is just speculative. It could be for people that are your staff members, that bureaucrats could be limited. But again, that's speculative only.
Okay. And then what's the intention on limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government? You mentioned regulations. Can you give an example of what this means? I guess I'm trying to understand what limiting the power of the federal government is.
Mm-hmm. I've heard Donald Trump, he said in his first term that his goal was to eliminate 2 regulations for every 1 new regulation. And it ended up in his first term that they eliminated 8 regulations for every 1 that they integrated. And he has challenged his staff right now to do it a 10-to-1. So it's to try to eliminate a lot of regulations which holds back commerce, just to eliminate different types of restrictions, regulations that government imposes on business.
Okay, but it would be basically, if we had a constitutional amendment that limited the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, it would not just eliminate the regulation, it would eliminate the federal government's ability to impose some regulations, right? That would be the intention?
I think that would be a fair assessment.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you.
Thank you.
To stay for closing. Thank you, Senator Lippincott. We'll now ask for invited guests, Mark Meckler. Good afternoon, welcome.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, Mr. Vice Chair, honorable members of the committee. My name is Mark Meckler, M-A-R-K-M-E-C-K-L-E-R, and I'm from Leander, Texas. I'm the president of Convention of States Action, and we are the organization that is moving this initiative forward nationally. I'm going to keep my remarks brief. Happy to answer questions. Y'all passed this particular application several years ago. And the intent to be here today is to remove the sunset clause. There are several states that passed this application with a sunset clause: Missouri, Oklahoma, Texas. Missouri and Oklahoma have both removed their sunset clause. Texas is in the process, I believe, will remove their sunset clause this session. The reason for that is we believe liberty never expires, first of all, and this is a fight for liberty. It is a fight to rebalance the jurisdiction between the federal and state governments. And you can rescind an application anytime you like. There is no necessity of a sunset clause. The legislature always retains the right to rescind any application at any time during a legislative session. So with or without a sunset clause, you have the ability to revisit this anytime that you feel it's necessary. Today, the federal government is out of control. Most people agree with this. It's not a partisan issue. People would like to see the power at home where they are. This is an issue, again, that crosses partisan lines. We polled this nationally. People want the power in their state legislatures. There's a reason for that. They elect you. They trust you. They have the opportunity to come here to Lincoln and actually be face-to-face with you or at home in their districts. For the average American, that is a literal impossibility with regard to their state representatives or state senators. They simply have no chance to cross paths with those people, talk to those people, or influence those people. They can actually see themselves sitting in your seats. We have grassroots activists all across the country that have come into the movement and then ultimately ended up sitting in a state legislature. This is what the framers intended. I can tell you, when I started this movement 12 years ago, I probably had a much lower impression of state legislatures than I do today. Having traveled to 49 of the 50 states and met with literally thousands of state legislators across the country, this is where the framers intended governance to take place. They had faith in you. Most of them had served in state legislatures or local councils. They knew that you would be the closest to the people, and they wanted the power closest to you, and that's what I'm here representing today. Happy to take questions, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Merkler, for your testimony. Check to see if there are any questions from the committee. Senator Lanowski.
Thank you, Chairwoman Sanders. Thank you for being here, sir. Appreciate it. So one thing you mentioned was it's a nonpartisan issue. When I was knocking doors, I had both Republicans, Democrats that loved it, and both those that hated it. Yeah. So I asked those who disliked it, what's the problem? And their biggest fear is a runaway convention. And at that point, I didn't know a whole lot about this, try to get my taste for exactly what it was. Can you explain why that wouldn't be possible, or how could we ease their fears?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. This is the most common opposition we hear to this. It's across the aisle. I would argue it's probably about 10% of folks feel this way. And it's just from a lack of understanding of the process. And let me start at the end of the process. I think that's the easiest way to answer the question. And I think Senator Lippincott did a pretty good job, so I won't go into too much detail about it. But whatever comes out of convention, and this is probably the most important thing we can all note, it's a suggestion. And personally, I could say I've never been in a meeting where suggestions were being made that I was afraid of suggestions. I might be afraid of actions that might be taken. I might disagree with them, but suggestions are just that, suggestions. And what comes out of a convention, if we can get 26 states to agree on something, are a suggestion or suggestions to the states. That is then sent out to the states for ratification, and it requires 3/4 of states, 38 states, to ratify anything that comes out of convention. I would posit this, that if you look at whether you're coming at this from a Democrat perspective, as far left as you want to go, a Republican perspective, as far right as you want to go, none of those proposals, far right or far left, could be ratified coming out of the convention. The country's far too divided. Well, I believe we're going to end up with the only things that can be ratified are things that are common sense, things like a balanced budget, term limits, things that the vast majority of Americans support.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kavanaugh.
Thank you. Thanks for being here, Mr. Meckler. You had, we spoke in the
Yes,
lobby and had a good conversation. I just sort of have some technical questions. I don't know if it was you or somebody else mentioned that basically Nebraska would have delegates based off congressional district. That's not spelled out in here, is it?
No, that's spelled out in the bill we'll be discussing later at the end of this hearing.
So does every state gets one vote?
That's correct.
And then we could send 1,000 delegates or one delegate?
Correct.
Okay. And then for a suggestion to be kicked out, does it take the same 34 or how many votes? How many
It takes
states?
a simple majority for something to come out of convention. So that would be 26 states.
Okay. 26 states. And I asked Senator Lippincott this, and you and I think, talked about it a little bit, the officials and members of Congress. Yeah. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think this is really important when we're talking about term limits, and you have experience with term limits in this state. I've seen it all over the country. There is a danger to term limiting elected officials only in that you empower the bureaucrats and potentially long-term staffers to run the government, and they stay around forever. And then officials, elected officials who are responsive to their electorate, get termed out of office. And so it creates a class of people that are more powerful than the elected officials. And so when we say other federal officials, what we're referring to is staffers, bureaucrats, actually also potentially the federal judiciary. Anybody that works for the federal government could have their terms working for the federal government potentially limited under that part of the application.
but it wouldn't allow us to put limits on lobbyists or anything like that.
No, those, I would say, unfortunately, on that one, lobbyists are outside the government system, so we couldn't do that. But I would say, and I think this is important, I think you and I had a brief conversation about this as well, that I do believe that we should close that revolving door on lobbyists coming out of the federal government and then going to make millions of dollars lobbying their colleagues. And under the third part of the application, limiting the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government, an amendment could be proposed to stop that revolving door. And I personally would be in favor of that.
Okay. And yeah, just to go back to that part, the limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess there's obviously an intention.
Yes.
To propose this. Is it just regulations, or what is there we're talking about?
So I think the simplest way to put it, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail as much as you would like. The simplest way to put it is when the Constitution was drafted, there were 17 enumerated powers. And those who were there drafting it said, these are the powers we're giving to the federal government and no more. And then with the 10th Amendment, we said everything else not prohibited to the states is reserved to the states and the people. Well, unfortunately, over probably the last 115 years, through a series of court decisions, the federal government has usurped a lot of state authority. I'll give you some very specific examples. The intention behind the Commerce Clause was simply to give the federal government the power to prevent interstate trade wars. Literally, in 1787, New York and New Jersey were about to go to war over trade. And they thought, well, this isn't going to work. We have to give Congress the power to deal with this. So the goal was to smooth out trade between the states. Unfortunately, the federal courts, including the Supreme Court, have interpreted that over the years to mean almost anything, that the federal government has power to regulate virtually everything. And so the goal would be to restrain that power somewhat. I'll give you some specific examples. Potentially, some people would say that there is no legal justification for the Department of Education in the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson spoke about this, actually said he couldn't spend money on University of Virginia because that would violate the Constitution. That's been held as legal by the United States Supreme Court, even though it clearly was not the intent of the framers. So there are many areas of the law where we could say, hey, we're going to push the federal government outside of this area of regulation. We're going to return that solely to the states. I would also argue, and I think it's a good way to put a bow on this, that almost everything that the federal government regulates in your state is also regulated by your state. The framers all believe that was impossible. Literally, we know the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson, big government versus small government guy. One thing that they both completely agreed upon, never debated, talked about, they agreed on it, is that government should have an exclusive sphere of influence. If the state can do it, the federal government really shouldn't, and vice versa. And so I think the goal was to move back to something closer to that.
Okay. And so would this take the form of one amendment or multiple specific amendments?
Are you saying specifically in that area?
In that area, yeah.
It could be one or more. I mean, for example, if somebody were to say, well, we want to deal with education, it could be an amendment simply saying something to the extent of the federal government shall not be involved in education. So it's just up to the folks who meet in convention. And this is according to the intent of the framers. They expected a convention to be a deliberative process. The reason that we know that is there were 11 conventions, interstate conventions before 1787. We know exactly how they worked and what the rules were. And they were used to setting out general ground rules for the convention and then getting into convention and having debates about the actual substance.
I've got one more for you that's just sort of my personal interest. Yeah. Would any of these allow us to put more restrictions on campaign finance and dark money and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I get asked that question all the time. The answer is no. And the reason the answer is no is because everything in this particular application is couched in terms of limiting the scope, power, and jurisdiction of the federal government. And what you're proposing would actually, in some ways, increase that power by saying to the federal government, you can impose more regulations. So there has been an effort by other groups. I don't think it's gone very far to overturn Citizens United. There's a group called Wolfpack that's out there promoting that. It would require a convention called for a different purpose.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions from the committee? Senator Anderson?
Thank you, Chairwoman. Mr. Meckler, thank you for being here. When Senator Kavanaugh mentioned the officials and it's kind of an ambiguous term, have you ever thought of they have something that when you get to the general officer level, you get the senior executive scale, and that's well defined. And that's really the decision-making level and above this executive level. Is there any thoughts that maybe that would be a definition you could use?
I think that's something that could be proposed at convention, Senator, that specific limitation. We used a more general, again, acknowledging the fact that a convention is supposed to be a deliberative body, and we wanted to give them the room. Now, I don't propose to be smart enough or expert enough in these particular subject matter areas to know what the right exact language would be for an amendment. The intent was to sort of set the table so that folks can get into a room and debate this.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Senator Greka.
So first, thank you for being here for your testimony. For an idea to get kicked out, it's 50% of the delegates of the states.
It's a majority, simple majority, so it would be 26 states.
Now and it needs to be approved by Congress at three quarters of Congress, correct?
Congress doesn't have a role. It actually goes out to the states for ratification. It would take 3/4 of the states to ratify any amendment.
Okay. But that same 3/4 threshold doesn't apply to this legislator. Each legislator has their own process of approving it.
You mean in convention?
No. Once it's kicked back to the legislators.
Then it's up to your legislature how to ratify amendments.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
And by the way, you specify that in your constitution already, how to ratify amendments.
Thanks.
Any other questions from the committee? Senator Ward-Kemper.
Thank you for being here. I guess just to clarify that, so once a resolution comes back to the states to decide, it's the 49 legislature people here that decides that, or does it go to a vote of the people of the state to decide if we're moving forward with that?
A little bit of nuance in answer to that question. It says specifically in the Constitution that Congress decides the mode of ratification and specifies either legislative or state conventions. And so that means it's going to come back here with an instruction, whether your legislature will ratify or you will hold a state ratifying convention. Interestingly, a state ratifying convention is whatever the legislature says it is. And literally you could convene the legislature as a state ratifying convention and choose to do it that way. Only one time out of the 27 amendments in American history has the ratifying convention methodology ever been used, and that was for the repeal of prohibition.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I got one, Chair.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Chair Sanders. Thank you again, sir. So let's say you send your delegate and everyone going to this convention has these three ideas that we want to work on. What if I say to one of the delegates, hey, I have a great idea about voting machines, or I have a great idea, and everybody starts rumbling in there, and that is a good idea. Can they take that on as well?
Are you specifically referring to voting machines or just any other?
Anything.
Yeah. Okay. The answer is only things that fall within the application's 3 tenets. And the reason for that is you have authorized the convention, 34 states, a supermajority of states, saying that you're going to talk about a particular group of things. And the reason that we know this is absolutely undeniably factual, our opponents will say that we have no way to know that, is there have been over 400 applications in the history of the United States calling for a convention of states. We've never had a convention of states. And the reason is the states haven't agreed, 2/3 of the states, on what they want to talk about. So the states actually have to agree in advance. That's how we know that this is binding. Now, when you get into convention, if you think about how the convention would work, you would have 34 states that have agreed, we're only going to talk about these 3 subject matter areas. That's a super majority of any convention. So the idea that somehow then they would drift outside the bounds of those doesn't make any sense.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Greco.
But they could. That's why Senator Lippincott has introduced LB 259, right?
I want to clarify, when you say they could, I think the answer is any human being at a convention could raise their hand and say anything they want to say, but they would lack the authority to act on those things because they've been appointed as agents of your legislatures, and I'm saying 34, a supermajority of the legislatures. They have specific authority. Their authority derives from the legislative appointment, and the legislature has appointed them to discuss only those 3 subject matter areas. So certainly any human being could raise their hand and say anything they want, but it would be deemed out of order and non-germane to the convention.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? I see none. Thank you very much for your
Madam Chairman, members of the committee, thank you.
Thank you. Any other proponents on LR 14?
It's sitting down too long. There you go. Got to get my cheaters out.
There you go. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chairperson Sanders and other members of the Government, Military, Veteran Affairs Committee. My name is Robert, R-O-B-E-R-T, Kipling, K-I-P-L-I-N-G. And then I'm from Omaha, Nebraska, District 18. I'm here to provide a brief description of LR 14. This resolution is to rescind a prior resolution and apply to Congress for a convention of the states to propose amendments to the United States Constitution such that the legislature applies to Congress under the provisions of Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States for the calling of convention of states limited to proposing amendments to the Constitution that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and limit the terms of office for its officials and members of Congress. Excuse me. 2, the legislature adopts this application with the following understandings, reservations, and declarations. For the U.S. Congress, upon 2/3 or 34 of all state legislatures passing Article 5 applications, is to call for a convention and determine a reasonable time and place for the initial meeting. It may determine whether proposed amendments shall be ratified by the legislatures of the states or by special ratification conventions, and must act only as expressly specified in Article 5. Congress has no other responsibility nor power to intervene with the convention, including but not limited to naming or setting the number of delegates to be sent, nor determining the rules for the convention. For Nebraska, a convention of states is limited to the consideration of topics specified in this resolution, nothing else. At the convention, states vote on the basis of one state, one vote. The named delegates to the convention remain exclusively within the authority of the legislature of the respective states, and the legislature may recall its delegates at any time for breach of their duties or violations of their instructions pursuant to the procedures adopted in this resolution. 3, that this application hereby repeals, rescinds, cancels, renders null and void, and supersedes the application to the Congress for a convention under Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States by this state in Legislative Resolution 14, as adopted by the 107th Legislature of Nebraska, second session in 2022. This application constitutes a continuing application in accordance with Article 5 of the Constitution of the United States until the legislatures of at least 2/3, 34, of the several states have made applications to Congress for an Article 5 convention on the same subject. Again, my thanks to Chairperson Sanders and the other members of the Government, Military, and Veteran Affairs Committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert Kipling, for your testimony. See if there are any questions from the committee. See none. Thank you for your written testimony.
Thank you.
Any other proponents on LR 14?
Don't let these big packets scare you. Most of it's just for your reference.
Thank you. And welcome.
Thank you. And, I think I got them in the reverse order of how you're walking around the room. My apologies. Okay, my name is Guy Mockelman. That's G-U-Y. Does this chair adjust? I'm like a really short person.
It doesn't.
Okay. Wow, I'm kind of thrown off.
That's why I said that.
Yes. Let me start over. Sorry. My name is Guy Mockelman. That's G-U-Y-M-O-C-K-E-L-M-A-N. I live in Omaha, and I'm a volunteer with Convention of States Action. Chairperson Sander, Vice Chairperson Anderson, members of the committee, thank you for hearing my testimony today in support of LR 14. A lot of things we could talk about. I'm going to talk about just two here briefly with you. And first is the opposition's concern about runaway conventions. Our society today, it seems, is largely unfamiliar with how the process of amending the Constitution works. As a result, there are those who claim to fear that an Article 5 convention could run away and destroy our Constitution, among other things. In its simplest terms, those of us who become paralyzed by such fears, we need only remember that Article 5 conventions do not approve constitutional amendments. Conventions only propose them. The same thing goes for Congress. Congress can only propose amendments. They cannot approve them. Rather, all proposed constitutional amendments per Article 5 of the Constitution must be ratified by at least 38 states in order to be approved. This is true regardless of whether the amendments are proposed by an Article 5 convention or if they're proposed by Congress. So only ideas with a broad consensus that can unite us across all of our differences, across all of this land, will survive the ratification process of 38 states. This intentional high bar means it is much easier to kill a great proposal than to pass a bad one. When the opposition today speaks and through some of their concerns, just remember that there are available rebuttals that are numerous, and they're backed up by precedents, history, documentation, etc. At the bottom of my written testimony, I have submitted a few resources for you. And here's one example, this book here. It's The Law of Article 5. It's by renowned Article 5 authority, Professor Rob Nadelson. So there is a lot of material here to answer concerns that get expressed. Moving on then to my second point, is that people are supporting and employing or supporting the process of employing checks and balances on the federal government. As an example, a recent poll by Susquehanna Polling and Research with weighting distributed between Democrats, Republicans, and independents, it showed that 71% believe additional limits on federal power are needed. 88% support term limits for career politicians. And putting it all together, 68% back a meeting of the states to propose amendments for fiscal responsibility, limits on federal overreach, and term limits. These results have been consistent with other polls taking over time on these issues. Now, to those packets, each of you have been provided with a list of those in your district who have signed our petition supporting an Article 5 convention. So the people are behind this effort again here in your districts too. More than 22,000 across the state have signed, but in your hands, you have yours. In closing, please support LR 14 today. Answer that sacred call and duty the framers gave you, and only to you, to bring this federal overreach back into order. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Mr. Muckelman, for your testimony and the information packet. Are there any questions from the committee? Senator Hunt.
Thank you, Chair Sanders. Thanks for bringing this. I want to thank you for the time it took to compile this information for us personally. I see in my particular district, there's 294 signers of this petition. And of course, a lot of these names are very familiar to me. So thank you for the information.
Any other questions? See none. Thank you very much. Again.
Thank you.
Any other proponents, please, for LR 14? Welcome.
Thank you. My name is David McPhillips, DAVID, MCPHI, LLIPS. I live in David City, and I speak in favor of LR 14. I believe the states must put fiscal restraints on the federal government, and they must be made effectively permanent in the form of constitutional amendments. Fiscal restraints are needed. According to the U.S. debt clock, federal debt stands at $36.5 trillion, which is $107 grand per citizen and $323 grand per taxpayer. The federal government is wasteful. Here are just three of many examples of waste the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, has uncovered. $236 billion worth of payment errors in fiscal year 2023, $516 billion in appropriations for expired programs in FY24, and $1.7 billion on 77,000 unused federal properties in fiscal year 2022. The federal government is irresponsible. Here are just three of many examples uncovered by DOGE and Senator Rand Paul. $15 million for contraceptives in Afghanistan and the Taliban, $3.3 million for just being LGBTQ in the Caribbean through U.S. aid, thousands of dollars for operas, comic books, drag shows, and musicals. Fiscal restraint should be nonpartisan. No rational person, no matter which party they belong to, wants to have their salary taken and wasted on errors, empty buildings, comic books, and musicals. And the last time the budget was balanced, it was in fiscal year 2001 under President Bill Clinton. Democratic President Bill Clinton. And a balanced budget is not good enough. The federal government must be forced to limit spending and to pay down the debt, not just balance a budget by raising taxes. Federal fiscal restraints must be made effectively permanent. American people now may be optimistic that the government waste is being discovered by DOGE and will be eliminated. However, this will only last until the next irresponsible president or Congress takes power. It doesn't matter which party they're from. Big banks will want to be bailed out, or some country in the Middle East will be bombed just to prop up the military industrial complex. The states must put in place amendments to make fiscal responsibility effectively permanent in the form of constitutional amendments. I ask you to please support LR 14. Perhaps through your support, we will see the 28th Amendment pass that limits federal spending and requires pay down of the debt, which would assure a stable financial future for us and for future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McPhillips. Check to see if there are any questions from the committee. I see none. Thank you very much. And thank you for your packet, your flyer as well, written testimony. Thank you. Are there any other proponents on LR 14? Please. Welcome.
Hi. Chairman Sanders and members of the committee. My name is Brianna Baldino, Briana Bowdino, and I live in District 2. Good afternoon. I am here representing myself in support of LR 14. This is the resolution to Congress for Convention of States to propose amendments to the United States Constitution. I'm one of over 22,000 voters who support the Convention of States project. I want Nebraska to pass the Convention of States, LR 14, to use Article 5 of our Constitution to propose amendments that limit federal spending, limit federal power, and set term limits on federal officials. I urge you today to move LR 14 to the floor for consideration in our unicameral. This would be a move towards real unity in Nebraska and our nation. The Convention of States bids all states to come together. It's a strong show of unity across all party lines, something that our nation needs desperately this very moment. It's not just a move for red or blue states, but for all states to speak up for themselves, for their values. This resolution also empowers citizens to promote self-governance. Self-governance is the pinnacle of personal responsibility, which is sorely lacking across our nation. The Convention of States organization has helped many citizens to speak up, many for the first time, creating an engaged constituency that's not satisfied to just let government happen to them, but to be active participants. And so the Convention of States doesn't just empower citizens, it also empowers our state legislature. A runaway federal government has long been distant and disconnected from Americans and flyover states like Nebraska. And the unique constituency of each state demands a robust and engaged state legislature that's brave to stand up against an overreaching federal government on behalf of their citizens. LR 14 seeks to limit an overreaching federal government. The elitist culture of laws for thee, but not for me in our Congress needs to stop. In the last few weeks, we've been shown the depth of our government's financial incompetence in every department. The same departments, like the IRS, who wanted access to audit all of our personal bank accounts, are now being exposed, showing they can't even audit themselves. And they spend our tax dollars like they've got daddy's credit card. And so the Convention of States seeks to set tax limits, spending, and borrowing limits. So Article 5 Amendment Convention is a bold move provided to us in our Constitution for such a time as this. So 19 states have all approved and passed for Convention of States. I ask you guys to move LR 14 forward in the name of unity for all the states and empowerment for Nebraskans. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ms. Bodino, for your testimony. Checking to see if there are any questions from the committee. See none. Thank you very much. Yep. Are there any other proponents? Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Mark Nelson, MarkNelson. My testimony is I'm a resident of District 2. Good afternoon, Committee Chair Sanders and Vice Chair Anderson and members of the committee. And thank you for allowing me to speak today regarding the LR 14. Article 5 of our U.S. Constitution states, the Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to this Constitution, or on the application of the legislators of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be valid to all intents and purposes and part of the Constitution when ratified by the legislators of 3/4 thereof. Now, here's a breakdown of that statement. Convention is a formal assembly for discussing and adopting proposals and a meeting to talk. Its intents and proposals is an amendment that has the same effect as if it were included in the original Constitution. Proposing is offering for consideration, and ratification is a formal note of confirmation or adoption. Simply put, the amendment convention is an opportunity for us to gather together to talk, to discuss the failures of our government and to seek a better way. Simply, we know Washington, D.C. is broken. She will not fix herself. She will not give up the power that she has broken from our states. She is a spoiled teenager that has kind of run amok. Your elected senators must step up to be the adults in the room. Only you can solve the problem and slap permanent restraints on those who would deny us self-governance. Please support LO 14 and what is wrong in Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nelson. I'm going to check to see if there are any questions from the committee. I see none. Thank you for your written testimony. Any other proponents?
Thank you. Oh my goodness. This is really low, isn't it? And I'm a tall person. Okay.
Good afternoon. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Committee Chair Sanders, Vice Chair Anderson, and members of the committee. My name is Karen, Karen, Rotschafer, Rotfchafer. I live in Western Lancaster County in District 32. I am a Vietnam era vet and a volunteer for Nebraska's Convention of States. Thank you for this opportunity. As our state senators, I'm sure you have felt the heavy hand of the federal government as it repeatedly usurped the rights of the states, rights as ratified by unanimous consent in our Constitution is on September 17th, 1787, a very long, hard-fought 11 years after we declared independence from Great Britain. Our government has most assuredly forgotten that it derives its power from the states. And that's only because the states have forgotten that it's their job to keep the federal government in check. When the federal government steps outside their constitutional box, and they have really overstepped their bounds, nothing, not even an election, can put them back in their place. When Nebraska Convention of States started this process in 2013, the national debt was $16 trillion plus. Now, our very long, hard-fought 11 years has passed since we started, and our debt totals over $36 trillion. $20 trillion in 11 years. Article 5 in our Constitution gives state legislators the power to control the feds through constitutional amendments. Of course, Congress is given the same power by the same Article 5. In our 238 years since our Constitution was ratified, Congress has proposed amendments to our Constitution and had 27 ratified. As the citizens of the United States, of these states and states, we've had none, absolutely nothing. Aren't there things that we think that the people want to put in our Constitution? Things that the guys back in 1776 and 1778 couldn't even think of. Ladies and gentlemen, as senators of our great state, you are exactly where you need to be right now. We've needed you for many years. I can't fix Washington, but you all can. It's your right, your responsibility, and indeed your obligation to call an Article 5 Amendment Convention.
Please continue your
Thank you.
final thoughts.
If we thought that the problems could be solved in Washington, we wouldn't have been here over the past 11 years and still today fighting to call an Article 5 convention. It's time to make a few changes to our republic. Be revolutionary in our time. You find yourself here on this committee in this moment to make history. Please make a difference, and you will make history. Be great for us. And pass 14. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony, Mrs. Rochett.
Thank you.
Hold on, let me see if there are any questions from the committee. We do have one, Senator Lanowski.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. Not really a question. I just want to thank you for your service.
I want to.
So appreciate that.
I want you to do your service now.
Yes, ma'am.
Let's get this passed.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any other proponents on LR 14? Hello.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and members of the committee. My name is Steve Davies, Stevedavies. Our nation was founded with a very limited federal government. And the founders told us, warned us, that the salvation of the states is due to the watchfulness of its citizens. We have lost that. The federal government, governments beget government, and they have absconded the state's power. It's time we take it back. And this is the only way that we do it. Governments won't reform themselves, just as we found last year we couldn't get good reform of property taxes. They have exploded spending, expanded transfer payments. And need I get into term limits? We look at recent people like Senator Feinstein, who almost died in office. She was incapable. Senator McConnell froze up many times in front of the microphone. And our recent president, it's time to take action and get back to our constitutional federal system. And as far as the opposition goes, a lot of it is unfounded fear-mongering. Need I mention, in November, we elected Hitler. That concludes my testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Davies. Check if there's any questions from the committee. I see none. Thank you. Any other proponents for LR 14?
up here, so you just, you want to pull it out for a minute? All right.
Teamwork.
Yes,
Welcome
makes the
back.
dream work. Hi, guys. Allie Bush, ALLIE-BUSH. I am representing the grassroots group, Nebraskans Against Government Overreach. We have supported the Convention of States time and time again. This is not a new position for us, so I won't dive into a whole bunch of the talking points. I know that most of the people prior to me covered everything. Really what I wanted to say is we like this legislation for the exact same reason we don't pay attention to what the federal government does. Our group focuses on the state level because that's where we can make a difference. And at the federal level, we don't have much of a voice. We can yell at our representatives till we're blue in the face. And at the end of the day, they do what they want because they've secured their position. And it is very, very difficult to beat an incumbent. We watched that happen at the last election and the election before and the election before. So long as you hold the coin purse, which somehow they develop in position in office, but they solidify that position. So we believe that it would be good to submit to a convention of the states, simply because we'd like to have a redo. Let's start over and get back to the basics where we were supposed to do. We started out with a 89-page constitution, and now with amendments and added in resolutions, we're at over 3,000 pages. That's not what our founding fathers had intended for us. And so we absolutely support this legislation. We ask you guys to move it forward.
Thank you, Mrs. Bush. We'll see if there's any questions from the committee. See none. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other proponents on LR 14? Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Sanders and committee. My name is Steve Jessen, STEVJESSEN, and I'm not going to bore you with any more talk. I just want you to know that everyone that come up here before you today is strictly a volunteer, and we're very active. Convention of States is nothing more than grassroots group of people, and that's the one thing I will tell you about Convention of States is that we're not only just trying to, this is just one of our goals is to call a convention and do that. But the real purpose of Convention of States is to create a grassroots, engaged citizenry to help you guys and let you know. And us being a unicameral, it is more important than ever that we, the people, are the second house and that we show up and let you know what's going on. And that's really all I have to say, and that's what we do on a daily basis.
Thank you, Mr. Jensen. Let me check to see if there are any questions from the committee. See none. Thank you.
Yep.
Any other proponents on LR 14? Welcome, Senator Halloran.
It'd be inappropriate to stand, but Madam Chairperson Sanders, Vice Chair Anderson, members of the military, veterans, and I would like to say that this is not new ground being plowed here, but I'd like to give a recap without going too much in detail, but a recap of where we came from. When I came in the legislature in 2017, did I spell my name?
No.
STEVEHALLORAN. Sorry about that. When I came in the legislature in 2017, I was preceded by Senator Laura Epke, who for at least 5 years had promoted trying to pass a resolution having Nebraska become part of a Convention of States, COS. She was unsuccessful, not without having tried hard. She handed that baton to me, and I spent most of my first 4 years trying to do that. So in 2022, we passed LR 14. It was passed with an ending date, and the purpose of that ending date, quite simply, is so that at a given date, you all could look at it again and see if it's necessary to continue with that resolution, right? Well, at that time, we were at $30 trillion in debt. I didn't hold out a lot of hope that we would, or Congress would, or Washington would, reduce the debt or limit the spending and not increase the debt. And as it turns out, I was proven correct because now the debt is $36 trillion. But I was willing to acquiesce to get the 33rd vote with a sunset provision. So here we are trying to start fresh with a fresh LR 14. I'm going to give a few bullet points about some of the opposition you're going to hear are going to give comments about runaway convention. We've heard about that, but words are important. Some of them will say, well, this will turn into a constitutional convention. And by historic definition, a constitutional convention is a convention for the purpose of writing a whole new constitution. I won't read Article 5 to you. It's very brief, but the founding fathers were very succinct in what Article 5 is intended to do, and that's simply to propose amendments as Congress can do. So with that, I will close. Be glad to address any questions you might have.
Thank you, Senator Helen, for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee?
Somebody, anybody? One question.
We see none.
Could I make a real quick last comment, closing
Yes, sir.
comment? Just a little bit of trivia. In our own state constitution, Article 18 addresses, the state constitution addresses term limits at the national level. It's in our constitution. And I think that's important. Also in 1979, Nebraska did pass a resolution for a balanced budget amendment. So this is not new ground being plowed. I encourage you to pass LR 14.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Are there any other proponents on LR 14? Any? Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeffrey, Jeffrey Barber, Barber. I'm a volunteer with Convention of States, but more importantly, I'm a father and a grandfather. And when I was born in 1957, I think the federal deficit was, actually there was a surplus of like $0.43 billion. And you look at what's happened in those 68 years since then, it's just rampant spending. And like I said, I'm a father and a grandfather, and I want to leave a better place for my kids and their kids. And I don't see any way that the federal government can continue the way it is and have a sustainable future for my children and their children. So I ask you to look at this amendment as a way for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barber, for your testimony. Checking to see if there's any questions from the committee. See none. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other proponent on LR 14? Any opponents on LR 14? Good afternoon, welcome.
Good afternoon, thank you. I am Sherry St. Clair, SHERI STCLAIR. I'm here this afternoon speaking on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Nebraska, which is an all-volunteer organization. The League has consistently testified in opposition to resolutions which would apply to Congress to call for convention of the states. And so we are also opposed to this, to LR 14. The League is concerned that there are many unresolved questions about the powers and processes of such a convention. A number of criteria have been identified which should be met prior to calling this convention. Firstly, it should be transparent and not conducted in secret. Representation should be based on population rather than one state, one vote. Delegates should be elected rather than appointed. Voting at a constitutional convention must be by delegate. The constitutional convention should be limited to a single topic. Only state resolutions on a single topic count when determining if a constitutional convention should be called. And lastly, the validity of state calls for an Article 5 constitutional convention to be determined by the most recent action of the state, knowing that some states have called for, and some states have rescinded their calls for conventions. These criteria are not yet in place, so the League of Women Voters of Nebraska urges the committee not to advance LR 14. Also, we do have participation in the convention current for the next couple of years, as mentioned earlier, due to prior resolutions.
Thank you, Ms. St. Clair, for your testimony.
Thank
Right
you.
under the clock there. Let me check to see if there's any questions. Senator Lanowski.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your testimony. After hearing all the expert advice on Convention of States, does it relieve any of your fears or any
No.
of your concerns?
No, it should still, we still feel it should still be a single topic rather than multiple topics. And there's some basic rules, I think, that need to be set prior to people going into such a convention. And I don't see that those rules have been agreed upon.
Okay.
Any other questions from Ms. St. Clair? See none. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Any other opponents for LR 14? Welcome.
My name is Alan Urich, spelled Allaneurek. I'm a member of, or a resident of District 27. I'm here testifying on my own behalf. I'm a retired lawyer and I have some interest in the Constitution because I have been a previous candidate for Attorney General in this state in 1990 and again in 2014. But I'm not testifying here as a partisan at all. And like Mr. Blomstead earlier, I really don't know if I'm an opponent or a neutral, but I'm here to, I guess, give a cautionary tale to the committee about going forward with this resolution, because it is, and I've paid particular attention to Mr. Lippincott and the testimony of Mr. Merkel. And if the world was only as we wished it would be, what they said would be fantastic, because it does give what Congress, the constitutional provision, the Supreme Court have not given us is some procedure on how this thing should be implemented. And that's what creates the scare, the runaway, all the worry about what this could involve. And we do have, and we know that in this process under Article 5, we are going to have, first of all, applications that have to be determined to be valid from the 34 states. Who's going to sort those out? Who's going to look at them? There are law review articles that say there's numerous possibilities. If you put an amendment in and you take it out, is it valid? Can you put in a specific provision like these two, like LR 14 and 21 do, about a specific thing you want the convention to hear, and will it still be valid? Who counts it? Who says yes? Who says no? On the tail end, there has been some litigation. The Supreme Court has said, oh, we're going to stay out of that. Maybe Congress has the power. I didn't hear anybody here say a lot of beneficial about Congress. Do we really want Congress to say, yeah, these are all valid, let's vote on it? Or do we really want Congress to say, you didn't meet the bar, we're not going to send it to the states? What kind of litigation happens then? There's so many uncertainties that I guess I would say, like the doctors do, first do no harm. And I could make some recommendations, but I don't know that anybody knows what should be done. I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Urick, for your testimony. Let me check to see if there are any questions from the committee. See none. Thank you again. Any other opponents for LR 14? Welcome.
Hello. Chairwoman Sanders, members of the committee. My name is Gavin Geis, that is spelled Gavingeis, and I'm the Executive Director for Common Cause Nebraska. Common Cause opposes LR 14 because we have concerns about the Article 5 convention process. We also believe there are elements of the previous bill, LR 14, that should be retained. The bill this is replacing LR 14, as has been mentioned, contains a sunset provision. We think that sunset provision is worth keeping for every piece of Article 5 legislation that is ever proposed. If we look at Nebraska's books, there are 9 resolutions for an Article 5 convention that are on the books going back to 1893. That includes calling for amendments on polygamy, on a balanced budget, on direct election of senators. In short, these things stay on the books until something's done about them. They don't go away. We think that the better thing than just letting them sit there is to always attach a sunset provision to ensure that these issues are being debated and redebated over the years. We believe that's good governance, because what's good this year for Nebraska in a decade may not be. And in 40 years, who knows how relevant it even is. I will note here, we have tried in the past to rescind these very, very old resolutions simply to clear the books, and there is no energy for that. There's no energy for that because opponents don't want to establish the precedent that these can be rescinded. They want them to remain on the books. So I would encourage you to retain a sunset provision anytime one of these is being introduced. The other reason we oppose LR 14 is because we believe the call is simply too expansive. What would not be included, what could not be included in a convention to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government? That is a big category of items. What constitutional rights would we be debating? Could we talk about giving states the ability to regulate political and religious expression? Is that on the table? Maybe it wouldn't pass, but is it on the table under that call? How about removing Fourth Amendment protections against government intrusion into our private lives? Is that on the table for debate in a convention called under that heading? We think it's a very, very broad call that could very well include those items. We don't think those are things that any Nebraskans or any Americans really want to talk about. So if we're going to talk about this and we're going to put resolutions out there that are going to sit on the books forever, they certainly should not be expansive, broad calls that bring into account every single constitutional right that we all agree on. But still, do we want to be debating the First Amendment? Do we want to be debating the Second Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, and so on? So for those reasons and others, but for those in particular, Common Cause opposes LR 14, and we urge you to do the same, to reject it. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Geis. Checking to see if there's any questions from the committee. Senator Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for being here, Mr. Geis. First, I got to know which side of polygamy were we on in that amendment?
What's that?
Which side of polygamy was?
We were against it. We don't want it.
Okay.
We don't. Yeah, we're not pro polygamy.
So you hit on one of the things I've been thinking about in this conversation is that's that particular section about restricting the federal authority. And you, of course, hit on what I was thinking, which is I appreciate some of the protections the federal government affords me as opposed to the state of Nebraska, right?
Right.
It protects me against it. But the one thing I did want to ask you about, since you're from Common Cause, is do you think that under this we could get a campaign finance limitation, or do we need a different convention of states?
Honestly, we probably do need a different. I would agree with Mr. Meckler that does not fall within the provisions of limiting the federal government, and that's a whole different thing. But I would also oppose, as much as I want to limit campaign finance contributions, we would oppose that call as well for many of the reasons that have been brought up today.
Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Any other questions from the committee? See none. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you very much.
Are there any other opponents on LR 14? Good afternoon. Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is John Waltz, John Walz. And I sure appreciate each one of you senators for your attention and your consideration here. This is straight off the National Archives website. The Federal Convention convened in the State House, Independence Hall in Philadelphia on May 14, 1787, to revise the Articles of Confederation. Through discussion and debate, it became clear by mid-June that rather than amending the existing articles, the convention would draft an entirely new frame of government. There's two ways that you can destroy the United States overnight. And this is my opinion. The first thing is enough stolen elections, and the second thing is a constitutional convention. And I can sympathize. So a lot of the people that are part of the COS movement, are friends of mine, and I sympathize with what they long for. They're looking for a correction in a runaway government, a federal government, and what they want to do is they want to alter a constitution, and even if they could limit it to the amendments that they want to, why do they think the federal government's going to abide by amendments to a constitution when they don't abide by the Constitution now? Right? The COS, well, it used to be, they called it the Constitutional Convention back in the 70s and 80s. It's the same thing. And you're talking about money from like David Rockefeller. George Soros was a big proponent of the COS and contributed to the COS up until 2016 or 18. That's the last I could see it. To push this agenda for globalism, to destroy the United States. Since 1972, there's been a big push. And in the 70s and 80s, they had 32 states that had signed on for an application for a constitutional convention. They were 2 states away. And through education campaigns, not only to the public, but to state legislators, states started rescinding those applications because they realized how serious this was. It would destroy the United States. The COS, that movement came about under the guise of a different thing than a constitutional convention. But if you read through Article 5, which has been in existence in almost 240 years, it hasn't changed. As a matter of fact, Article 5, what it states is the Congress, on the application of legislators of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention. That's all it states. So what happens is, as 2/3 of the states call for a convention, who sets up all of the rules? Mr. Meckler was incorrect. That all falls back to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 of the Constitution. The Congress sets all of the rules for convention, who the delegates are, how many states get, whatever they want. I mean, I could go on and on. I got all kinds of responses, but
Thank you, Mr. Waltz.
yes.
You want to just finish up your thought?
There's never been a constitutional convention under our current United States Constitution. There's one thing I think is very important here. And if you look at like the New York Assembly appointment for the delegates, and all of the states were the same. This is quote, for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation and reporting to Congress and the several legislators. Article 13 under the Articles of Confederation stated that every amendment, every revision to the Articles of Confederation, it had to be unanimous consent with all of the states. What they did in the convention, they altered those rules. Rhode Island never even sent any delegates to the convention. They didn't think that they didn't care. But nothing did not change. Well, they altered the rules so it'd be 3/4 would have to ratify. And that's how we got our US Constitution. There's nothing to change a constitutional, there's nothing to stop a constitutional convention now from saying 51%, or they could even say 25%. They can do whatever they want. That's the point. And it's not a matter of hypotheticals. It's already proven. We've already went through it in history. Now, thank God in 1787, we had godly men that were very selfless, cared about our Constitution. Do you think that today we would be able to find enough delegates that wouldn't go in there with $100,000 and come out of there as billionaires because they sold everything? They sold all our freedoms down the road. We need to scrap this whole idea of entering into a convention. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Waltz, for your testimony. Hold on, let me check to see if there's any questions from the committee. Senator Lentnowski.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your testimony, Mr. Waltz. So I can see your concerns that things might not go as we think they should. Don't you have the equal concerns as how it's going now, and we're trillions and trillions of dollars in debt, and we can't balance our budget, and we have billionaires that are congressmen on $200,000 salaries?
Like I said, They don't abide by the Constitution now. They're not going to abide by further amendments, even if you were able to just stick with the amendments that you want to. You're not going to like this part of the answer. The reason that they're at right now is not only because of the federal government, but it's because of the state legislators. They allow it to happen. The state of Nebraska is its own sovereign. And if you look here, you know this, the federal government has very limited responsibilities, enumerated, very limited. And then on top of that, you've got the 10th Amendment. Use that. Pass legislation, say anything that's not constitutional, create like a Doge committee or something. Anything that the federal government's doing, if it doesn't fall within the constitutional, the enumerated powers of the federal government, we don't participate. We don't fund, we don't do anything. We ignore it. It happens all the time. It's called nullification. That's the power that you have.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? See none. Thank you for your testimony.
Yes, ma'am.
Any other opposition to LR 14? Welcome.
Good afternoon. My name is Wes Dodge. Dodge is D-O-D-G-E. I'm with Represent Us. I'm also on the board of Common Cause, and I'm the vice president of Better Ballots Nebraska. All of those are volunteer. Nobody's given me any money for any of this stuff I do as far as this is concerned. And I was kind of entertained. I was curious if Mr. Meckler testified that Mr. Clark might be the most powerful person in this room when he was talking about bureaucrats being here for a long time. But in the handout I've given you, I started it with Article 5 because there's been a lot of reference to it, and I'm hoping you've looked at it. But, when I went to law school, we learned about the Supremacy Clause. I actually learned about it in civics in high school. And when we're doing these things with the state, I think ultimately when we get to some sort of dispute at the federal level, the Supremacy Clause is going to take control, and they're going to say, hey, Article 5 takes control. So if Article 5 takes control, we can do whatever we want to do, meaning whoever these people are at this convention, because Article 5 does not say things about specifics that we can limit what we're dealing with. The other thing I'm curious about is if we're trying to limit through our legislation, and I don't know if all these other states that have passed it, I think it was said 19, I can't remember exactly how many, does their language match exactly the language we have? That'd probably be the only way I can see around maybe the issues with the Supremacy Clause. Then there's something from a constitutional perspective that kind of scares me, and it kind of reaches into some of our representative problems we have right now, is that's that step 2 after they pass an amendment. So we get 3/4 of the states to say, let's have a convention. And then they say, we want these amendments. And then when we send these amendments down, we only need 26 states to vote for those amendments that would get passed. And I like listening to the other testimony because it piques my interest. And I got out my phone and did the math, and I looked some things up. The 26 least populated states in the United States have about 18 million people. We have 340 million people in the United States. So then I did the math. That means that it's possible that we could have amendments passed using this system that states who only represent 5.5% of the population can make us live under amendments that do that. I see the light's yellow, but as I looked at this in other ways, like Senator Lanowski, we've already got things that are sitting out there to deal with the budget. We can deal with those individual issue things. We've already got things out there that deal with term limits. We can deal with those. We don't need this all-encompassing aspect of this in order to do these things. And then nobody's really addressed it, but if you dig a little deeper, there's a lot of money getting thrown at this. Now, the convention states people say, hey, we're all volunteers, and I'm sure they are, and I'm sure they're all good-hearted, sincere people. But when you look around, there's a lot of money from a lot of people out there that want things like they want the judiciary to be controlled. I don't know if you want me to
wrap that thought up.
Okay, they want the judiciary to be controlled, and they want to do anything they can to limit taxes. And, given those circumstances and the money behind it, I'm just always, when big money gets in it, I'm just really curious about what their real motives are.
Let me check to see if there are any questions from the committee. I see none. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Any other opposition on LR 14? Welcome back.
Thank you very much. Kathy Wilmot, Kathywilmot. I've been waiting for the smoke alarm to go on. There's been so much smoke blowing here going on. And I was so glad to hear some of the good research, someone researching other than COS materials. LR 14 was originally passed in 2022. There was a lot of dealing going on. And finally, they even had to suspend the rules to get that thing passed. And now we're back here 2 years later, trying to renege on that particular agreement of the sunset. LR 14 lists many declarations in a misguided attempt to tell Congress what it can and cannot do, one of which is each state will only have one vote. Article 5 does not tell us how many delegates, doesn't tell us how the whole thing's going to go. You've been hearing that. Between 1973 and 1992, 22 bills were introduced in the U.S. House and 19 in the U.S. Senate that sought to establish a procedural framework that would apply to an Article 5 convention. The Senate passed what's called the Federal Constitutional Convention Procedures Act on two separate occasions. And one was in 71, in 1883. And the source for that is the Congressional Research Services document. And in those bills, it called for proportional representation, not one state, one vote. And how would our 5 electoral votes stand up against California's 54 votes? Advocates of a convention, because of their frustration, have introduced a new way of counting Article 5 applications. In the past, we've always been told it has to be a single subject, but now in the COS pocket guide and at their mock conventions, they have suggested dozens of subjects that would supposedly fall under this umbrella language that they have in their proposals, impose fiscal restraints on the federal government and to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Certainly limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, we need to do something, but we've got the words in the Constitution now. We just fail to hold their feet to the fire. Also, the American Constitution Foundation, in their study on how to achieve an unlimited general constitutional convention under Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution, came up with a new way of counting applications. That group has linked together applications as diverse as the anti-polygamy that you heard about, and the Convention of States Project, the Balanced Budget Amendment, and applications trying to avert the Civil War, which I thought we were past that point. And it is astonishing to me that the ACF's white paper on the Article 5 General Convention of States, they combine Article 5 applications from the states to Congress from the year of 1789 up to some of the most recent applications in order to achieve their stated goal. Their new way of counting is useful in achieving the ultimate goal of an unlimited general Article 5 convention. And I just ask you, please, protect our Constitution. I've been studying this since the late 1880s, when then Governor Leavitt of Utah and Governor Ben Nelson of Nebraska was calling for this convention. It's very dangerous.
Thank you, Ms. Belmont. See if there's any questions from the committee. Senator Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for being here, Ms. Wilmot. I think you might have, in the interest of time, skipped over a part that I thought was interesting in your testimony. Could you elaborate on the limitation of the federal government, indeed the Supreme Court's decisions that have struck down restrictive gun legislation?
Yeah, we have, I think it is Hawaii, and then most recently California has made a call to restrict and get rid of pretty much the whole Second Amendment, which quite frankly, you were warned about all this opposition coming forward, these wild ideas. But, you know, we had been saying probably for 25 years, and I forgot to mention I was representing Nebraska Eagle Forum, but we've been warning people, this can be anything. And, you know, we have a lot of hunters and everybody here in Nebraska. We happen to be some of them. And we appreciate our firearms. We also know that's why that right was given to us, not just to hunt, but to protect ourselves. And so that's something that could fall under here too. And yes, I was getting a little worried about my time because I was tongue twisting pretty bad.
It's tough to get it in 3 minutes, but thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Mr. Greka, Senator Greka.
Thank you for being here. Ms. Wilmot. We're talking about an organization's way of counting the calls, right? That's the earliest one of them says 1700s.
Mhm.
What organization was that again?
Of that particular group, let me look if I can see.
Oh, it's in your testimony.
Oh, yeah, I think, I don't know that I mentioned an organ, oh, I did too, American Constitution Foundation.
So, do you know how who counts the calls for this?
No, and that's what was so refreshing was some of the, I can't remember the gentleman's name that came up and testified. You know, he was finally honest. If everybody'd be honest in this room, nobody knows. Those are some of the details. No one knows. And the only other time we saw it happen was 1787. And they were given the Articles of Confederation. They were supposed to tweak them. There were things that weren't perfect and they were to fix those. And it was a requirement for 13 of 13 colonies to approve. And look what happened. And so, yeah, we always get told, my gosh, do you really think 38 states would vote for something bad? You're darn right I do, because you have no guarantee that that isn't one of the articles that they're going to open up. In fact, Robert Kelly, General Counsel for Convention of States, I have a video, and he admitted it is a broad call. Those are his exact words. He also stated that basically it opens every section of our Constitution. That's the concern. And when their own general counsel, which by the way, they didn't fire him when he said that, he is still general counsel for Convention of States. So that's still the mentality. That's still the thought process. And that's the reality we need to understand. We're all, and you know, I told you what isn't going to work. And I'll tell you, I don't know how this thing would come out. And I wish that they would all be honest and tell you they don't have any idea either. They have a lot of pipe dreams. They have, and again, many of the people on that side are friends that I've worked with on many issues for probably 30 years now. And I know they mean well. I know, but they're grasping at straws, and we better be honest with ourselves and admit that. Thank you.
Any other questions? See none. Thank you, Mrs. Wilmot.
Thank you.
Any other opponent for LR 14? Good afternoon, welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the chair and the committee. My name is Jerry Arnold, Jerry I'm here in opposition to this motion. Many of the proponents this afternoon have alluded to the fact that that this convention would be very limited in scope. And so one question I have is, if it is so limited, why is there the urgency or the need to circumvent the normal amendment process to call a convention? If that was the case, then why don't we just go through the regular process? Another concern I have is that one of the earlier speakers alluded to the fact that people could always raise their hand and vote to change. And the way I interpreted that was he was raising the possibility that once they arrive at the convention, they could vote to change the scope and to change the nature of why they were there. And I just have very real concerns that I think the Constitution that we have has served us pretty well for 250 years. And I hate to see us open up the possibility that we could throw that out the window and come up with a convention that was not limited in scope. And I'm hearing a lot of concerns about the process and, you know, the uncertainty about the nature of a convention and who would control that. And I just think that if we open that possibility, we're opening ourselves up to changes that maybe none of us would be very well served by. And I hate to see our government go in a direction that would not continue to serve the people of this country. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony. Check to see if there are any questions. See none. Thank you, Mr. Arnold, for your testimony. Any other opponents on LR 14? Welcome.
My name is Wes Wilmot, WESWILMOT. And I will start out by saying I'm not as eloquent as some of the people in my house, but I do have some points. First of all, it's sad to see what's going on here. Some outside forces have come in here and taken us somewhere that I don't really think we want to be. I've been called the opponent, the other side, and I've been told that I'm scared of the Easter Bunny. And as Nebraskans, can't we do better than that? We're all Nebraskans. We need to work through this, look at the facts, and make a decision. And that's where I come from. You've got plenty of attorneys here in this building that can give you the details of how this would work. But I know that there are facts and then there are things that are not facts. The Article 5, read it. It's in one of my later testimonies. It is that. That's the only fact. The rest of this is conjecture. And I worked in the field of high-tech electronics for over 30 years. And I know that if I'm going to put wire A in hole B, I better know what's going to happen. You know, I don't want conjecture. I want somebody that knows how that works. Or otherwise, I'm going to ruin a lot of people's days and your phones won't work. So anyway, the facts are the facts and everything else is not facts. Also, I don't understand why this, all of a sudden, this intensity to do this now. It's got a sunset clause coming, and some of you in this room made the promise for that sunset to be there because this wouldn't have passed when it did otherwise. It was real obvious. You broke the rules to even get it, and the sunset was the thing that made it happen. And now you're going to turn. Some of you weren't here, I know, so you're not compelled to stand by that. Some of you were, and I think, you know, to turn your back on those people. I hope they can still work with you, but just to out and out turn your back on somebody that believed something you told them. I think that's sad. Anyway, either way, you know, that you go with this. And if you do pass it, I do hope that maybe in a few years, some more members will come in that aren't compelled to follow what you did, and they do away with this altogether. Anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Wilmot, for your testimony. Are there any questions from the committee? I see none. Thank you very much. Any other opposition to LR 14? Welcome.
Thank you. My name is Spencer Rice, SPENCER RICE. I'm here just on behalf of myself in opposition. When I came in, I really wasn't concerned about the technicalities of the Constitutional Convention, although I'm starting to have a little bit more on that. But that's not really where my concerns are. My concerns were more that the points of the convention, as called, just seem to be a tourniquet for a cut. We have the mechanisms to deal with these issues. The voters, it's on the voters. We need to be picking better representatives and congressmen and whatnot to ring it in. And that's an easy thing to say. And to that, that's why I say our efforts should be better on combating lobbying and gerrymandering and eliminating first past the post voting to get rid of, or to hopefully alleviate our two-party system that our first president warned us against. As to limiting the power of the federal government, whenever I hear stuff like that, I just remember that, thank goodness, I was born a man and I was born white. I don't need the federal government to protect my rights. Ruby Bridges is still alive. If it wasn't for the federal government, she wouldn't have gotten into that school. I probably wouldn't have been going to school that was probably 50% black. And who knows who I would have served with in the Navy. There are problems with the budget, and there are many people who deal with the federal government in ways most people don't. And I'm sure that bureaucracy is quite intimidating and obtuse sometimes. And these things should be addressed. And to that, when people mention how great it was back in the 50s or 60s, they talk about spending running away. The thing I never really hear about is how corporate taxes have fallen and taxes on the higher have come down to where the rest of us are paying. And there's a time and place for a debate about what is fair and whatnot, but it just seems like we miss those considerations as well. Those are kind of just my more major concerns about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Royce, for your testimony. Are there any questions? Seeing none, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else here to testify in opposition to this bill? Seeing none, is there anybody in a neutral position? Seeing none, Senator Lippincott, you're cleared to come back up while he's advancing in the record were 52 proponents, 38 opponents, and 0 neutral. Senator Lippincott, welcome back. It's all yours.
Thank you, sir. A number of years ago, I ran for this position 3 years ago, and I didn't know much about convention of states. And a little bit like Senator Lanowski there. And so I kind of thought, why try to fix something that's broken? The Constitution seems to be working pretty well right now. So why mess with it? That was my thoughts. And I remember picking up a Convention of States booklet at the state fair, and I read through it. And of course, obviously, it's printed by the Convention of State folks, so I got their side of it. But listening to the opponents, I think it's very wise to have the other side, to get both sides of the issue and to be cautious. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's everything right with it. That's why there has to be so many hoops that we have to jump through before this comes to fruition. 34 states, we're at 19 right now. So more people look at, evaluate, think about this whole process. And of course, once that happens, and we've already talked about this, I don't need to repeat myself, but then it goes through another process where 38 states have to agree to it. One thing I noticed in walking around for campaigning is the wisdom of the common folks. And I think Senator Hunt just talked about 290 people in your district signed on to this. Is that right? Is that what the figure was? It was something like that, whatever you mentioned. Yeah. But it's interesting to note right now that 86% of Democrats that are polled support this, or they support term limits, more correctly. 90% of Republicans. So the question then becomes, who sets the rules for Congress? Because they don't seem to be coloring inside the lines for spending, for instance. $36 trillion debt, it just continues to go more and more. Term limits, spending, and the size of government. It's all about accountability and transparency. And this is something, this movement, Convention of States, is like the barking dog nipping at the heels of Congress saying, you need to do something because right now you're not. So that's how the Bill of Rights came into being, by external dogs biting at the heels of Congress. The 17th Amendment also was brought about that way. So in essence, hopefully this will bring about action in Washington, D.C. to bring about change.
Thank you, Senator Lippincott. Senator Lanowski.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Thank you, Senator Lippincott. I have about 3 or 4 questions here that I hope you can answer. So first of all, when are the articles determined and who determines those articles?
Well, again, once the 2/3 of the states They say these are the three broad areas that we need to talk about. And then once the 2/3 agree to that, like we talked about with John Kavanaugh over there, Senator, then they meet, and we just use the example of Omaha would be the meeting place. So at that point, that's where they get down into the specifics as to what is going to be voted on by 38 states, 3/4 at that point.
Okay, is the delegate bound to vote correctly? Do they have to follow the wishes of their constituents when they?
They do. I believe I think it is a felony if they violate that.
Okay. Okay.
And each state gets one vote. They can send, just like we talked about a few moments ago, they can send 100 people to Omaha in the example that we used, but Nebraska, along with all 50 states, only get one vote per state.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, sir.
Any other questions? Senator Greco.
What is the delegate selection process?
The legislative body has to determine that.
For
So
each
in other
state?
words, they could say, you're our guy.
So every state decides their own.
Their own, correct. That is correct, yes.
I guess I wasn't aware there was already a call that the state had done. When is the current sunset on that call?
It's February 1st, 2027. Correct. 1 February 2027.
You quote the number, there are already 19 other calls.
Yes.
What's the earliest one?
I do not know.
2013 was the first.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I have concerns on sort of the lack of structure of how it would go should a convention be called, who counts the applications. Once we're in the room, who runs the meeting, who counts the meeting, who determines that we got to 50. So is there a structure, is that in the Constitution that outlines all these provisions and procedures of how the convention is ran?
No. There's not a written structure at this moment.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Senator Kavanaugh.
Thank you, Vice Chair. Thanks, Senator. It's been a very interesting conversation. I have a couple similar questions. Just looking at the resolution as it is, I'm trying to figure out where it says that it's by a majority within the body once constituted. You know, am I missing that or? So you're saying, so it takes 34 states to call a convention, is that right?
Yes, correct.
And then once the convention's called, under what you're saying is that this resolution, if 34 states adopt it, then the states can send however many delegates they want. And if we host in Omaha, the more the merrier, but for hotel room purposes. But then each state only gets one vote. Is that in the resolution here?
Yeah.
Okay. And then Ms. Wilmot made reference to the Federal Constitutional Conventions Procedure Act that was passed, it looks like in 71 and 83. I guess I'm trying to understand how, and it does say in here that Congress has no other authority other than ministerial, but I think Congress has already taken that action. So it's not that they're going to take any new action. They've already taken the action. When we adopt this resolution, it's with the understanding that Congress has already set out the rules. So why are we not going to be held to those rules?
You mean once we meet after like in Omaha, for instance? Is that what you're talking about?
Well, the resolution says Congress will have no authority other than ministerial to call it.
Correct.
And I guess my question is, it sounds like, and maybe I'm wrong about this based off, I don't know this is what is Ms. Wilmot's testimony, but if Congress has already adopted this procedure, isn't the convention going to be held to that previously adopted procedure?
All Congress, only thing that they can do is they can say the location and the time.
Okay.
Yeah, that's it. Otherwise, they're,
And Article 5, by the way, the website's great. I was looking through it a lot. I apologize if I was distracted because the website is great. For convention states, has all the states on there and the dates. But it has Article 5 on there. I took a look at it. It doesn't specify any of these things, and that's a lot of the fears people were talking about. But it specifically doesn't specify that the convention would have to be one state, one vote, right? The adoption of the amendments is set in Article 5, and adoption of the resolutions is set in Article 5. But the actual kicking out of that resolution doesn't have to be by one state, one vote, right?
one vote per state.
Well, I guess my reading of Article 5 would be, I would argue that that doesn't say that in Article 5. And so my question would be, why? Why would we say that it's one person, one vote? As I can't remember, Mr. Dodge maybe said that it would be 18 million people would be represented by the smallest 38 states.
I don't want to mislead you, but I'm quite certain that I read it's one vote per state, 50 votes. That's it. No more than that.
Okay. Well, I appreciate this finishing conversation. Thanks.
Any other questions? Thank you, Charlotte, for your time. That concludes our hearing on LR 14. And we will proceed on to LB 359.
Let's check real quick. Julie, you need a 10-minute break.
Well, all right, Rita, we promised our viewers that we'd have a whirlwind day, and we certainly have. It's
not over yet.
It's not over yet. We still got more to go. But wow, our viewers have been watching a committee hearing in Nebraska in the Government, Military, and Veterans Affairs Committee. And they've been listening to testimony on LR 14, which is trying to remove a sunset clause on a resolution we passed in 2022. Just what's your initial thoughts on what you saw there in that committee hearing?
Well, as usual, I was impressed with our grassroots turnout. I was impressed with our sponsor, Senator Lippincott, did a great job introducing our resolution. As always, impressed with Mark Meckler. He is always superb. Never have to worry about him not performing well. And yeah, they just did a great job. I thought the testimony was compelling. You see, our sponsor got a little bit hung up there at the end on a final question, but I'm sure that Mark will reach out and provide the answers that were needed there. You know, the one state, one vote is not only a matter of historical precedent, but it's also in the nature of the process as being a convention of the states. Each state is an individual sovereign with equal representation at the convention. That's the way it works. That's the way interstate conventions have always worked. So yeah, I thought it was a good hearing. Interesting always to see the League of Women Voters come out in opposition, to see Common Cause come out in opposition. And then we have people, you know, accusing us of being funded by George Soros. So it never
I'd love to see that George Soros money, Rita. I'd love to see it.
Yeah, never a dull moment in our committee hearings. And, you know, if you have been watching our broadcast the whole time, we originally were planning to bring you not only the hearing on our application, which would remove the sunset clause in Nebraska. We were also planning to bring you the whole hearing on the 34 Ready bill as well. I think they're doing the hearing on that right now. But because that hearing went on so long, we're going to change our plan. We're going to go ahead and break now. We will keep you posted on what happens with the 34 Ready bill, and our folks are still there to support it. But we wanted to wrap up Nebraska. We're going to hear from Regional Director Deanna Beckett and get her reaction. But then while this hearing was unfolding, the Kansas Senate had its debate and vote on second reading on our application there in Kansas. So as soon as we're done here and we get Deanna's reaction to Nebraska, we're going to bring you another live stream of the Kansas Senate debate, because of course, producer G was recording that for us. So Deanna, What are your thoughts? How did you think it go? Any surprises on how it went?
No, just the typical opposition or detractor comments and what they called us liars. Of course, they called, like you said, they called us funded by George Soros. And I wouldn't be working here if we were funded by George Soros. My husband would absolutely not like that. So that's an outright lie. But I thought Senator Lippincott was our great champion, and of course, trained up by Senator Halloran, which it was great to see him attend, and he was, of course, gave us the history on the passing of this, and very thorough. I enjoyed listening to them, and I also enjoyed when Senator Halloran defined what a constitutional convention was and made it forthright of what the difference is between that and an amending convention. And still, our detractors went down that road. But otherwise, I thought our team did great. And I did want to clarify the numbers that they mentioned towards the end with the 38 versus 32. We had 38 online testimony submissions by our grassroots, and the opposition, our detractors, had 32. So we did outnumber them. And that just came from, more messaging into our grassroots and our grassroots taking action. And we appreciate that.
Well, Deanna, you have been so busy. Just like every week we come on here, it's one of your states that has some legislative action. So I don't know how you're keeping it all straight. There's just so much going on in your region right now. What's your reaction to Kansas as well?
That was challenging to hop back and forth. I had to listen on top of Nebraska and hop, and then of course there's texting going on. It's good to see the results from that. I'm not going to be a spoiler and not give you a spoiler alert, but it is good news, and and then it's challenging for having this much activity, yes, but it's also exciting, and it keeps the blood flowing. But it's great to see some victories and moving forward, and. Yeah, it's hard to pull some words together.
And more to come tomorrow. So Deanna, we're going to wrap up this live stream, and we'll have a separate live stream. We're not going to just continue it here. So if you're watching and you want to see that Kansas Senate debate and vote on second reading, watch our socials for the link to that. Or go to conventionofstates.com/COS live so you can catch that. And Deanna, third reading, and spoiler alert, third reading in Kansas for the final Kansas Senate vote will be tomorrow. We'll keep you posted when we hear more about timing of that tomorrow. But Deanna, hopefully you can be back with us tomorrow to recap that with us.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. They have to, of course, go to the supermajority. We've got that 2/3 vote rule in Kansas, and it's looking pretty promising.
All right. Thanks, Deanna.
Thank you, Deanna. All right, Rita, you said we still got more to go to, so we're going to go over to Kansas now. Like Rita said, go to conventionofstates.com/COS live if you want to check that out, or go to our COS socials so you can stay in the know with the next state that we are going over to do live coverage. Rita, it's been so much fun, as always, doing this with you all day long. That's what we're here for. We're here to cover all of the legislative action that's going on across the country. All right, we got a country to save, so time to get back to work.